This is the presentation on the church and state in early modern Europe. The period that we're looking at includes the 15th, the 16th, and the 17th centuries. And what I want to think about today is this relationship between the religious authorities in Europe and the political authorities, whether they are a republic or a monarchy or an oligarchy. This relationship, which had been mostly stable throughout much of the medieval period, really going back to about 11th, 12th century, begins to fundamentally change with the Protestant Reformation, as well as developments in the political milieu of early modern European kingdoms, specifically with the rise of absolutism as a dominant philosophy in the politics of Europe. The changes look different depending upon the locality, depending upon the particular kingdom or region, because the Reformation impacts different places in different ways. Some regions break away entirely from the Roman Catholic Church, while others remain very steadfast and loyal to the papacy and loyal to the church. For us, it can be difficult to grasp how profound this relationship was, because for us, politics and religion are separated at a fundamental level in our society. You have the church that deals with one area of human existence, whereas politics, the government, deals with another area. And they certainly connect and overlap in certain regards, but their spheres of influence are very much divided and separated. At the time, however, in the early modern period, the two, politics and religion, are so closely intertwined. It's difficult for us to fully comprehend it. The two fed off of one another. They assisted each other in different ways, and at times were at deep conflict with each other. The image that you see is of the title page for the English Great Bible, which this edition comes from 1539. It was commissioned by the King of England, Henry VIII, and it is one of the earliest English Bibles to be printed. This was printed after Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church, so it's usually considered a Protestant Bible. And what we see in the image is King Henry sitting on his throne, and just above his head you can see just a small image of Jesus peering out from heaven. And Christ is handing the Word of God down to the king. The king, in turn, is handing the copies of the Bible over to his closest counselors, both his clergy and his noble lords. And below, at the very bottom, you have a group of people, the common folk, all saying the same thing: Vivat Rex, long live the king. Now, the people don't have copies of the Bible themselves. While Henry allowed each church to commission or buy a copy of the English Bible, very few people had the resources, the money to purchase one for themselves. But it is interesting that in this title page, they're not saying, praise Jesus or hallelujah, glory be to God. They are saying, long live the king. And what the image depicts, amongst other things, is a clear relationship of the state's authority over the church in England. For a very long time, the church and state had occupied different areas of influence and had been closely connected with one another. Here, the king is clearly asserting his authority over the church. He sees himself as the head of the Church of England. And this image is a good example of how this relationship between church and state is being renegotiated in England and being renegotiated throughout Europe in the period. Part of the renegotiation between the church and state and their relationship with one another in the period had to do with the introduction of a new political philosophy in the 16th century, what is often referred to as absolute sovereignty or absolutism. The philosophy began to gain traction in early modern Europe, and the essential argument was that absolutism is the most effective and efficient way to manage the political state. It gave all authority and power over to a single sovereign. Its appeal was partly due to the growing instability in the church with the Reformation, and also growing instability in the ranks of the political sphere of early modern Europe. In fact, one of the first thinkers who promoted this philosophy was an advisor to the King of France in the 1550s, a man named Jean Bodin. In his 6 books of the Commonwealth, and the title page is the image that you see, Bodin argued that absolutism is natural, it's part of the natural law, and that there is only one sovereign who should hold all legitimate power and authority in the state. The sovereign should never be actively resisted. That doesn't mean that people couldn't speak out. They couldn't disagree with the sovereign. So Jean Bodin was an advisor to the King of France and disagreed with him on several occasions. However, Bodin argues that they should never actively resist, meaning they should never rebel. They should never take up arms against the sovereign. They should never disobey him when he makes a final decision. Even if the sovereign commands something that goes against God's law, Bodin advises that people should disobey the sovereign, but they should accept the punishment for their disobedience. So obey God, do not violate the moral law, do not violate divine commandment, but at the same time accept the sovereign's punishment for what the sovereign has deemed to be wrong. The 6 books of the Commonwealth is one of the first of many works that will advocate for absolutism, and many monarchs in Western Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe begin to attempt to set themselves up as absolute monarchs. In England, one of the first is James I. He's James VI of Scotland and becomes James I in England in 1603. He writes his own work advocating for absolutism and tries to set himself up as an absolute monarch. Of course, it's one thing to claim to be an absolute monarch and wield absolute authority. It's quite another to actually wield it in a country, even a small country. And very few rulers in early modern Europe actually achieve this level of authority and power. One of the key figures in the development of absolutist philosophy in early modern Europe is the English philosopher named Thomas Hobbes. In the 1640s, Hobbes witnesses something that kind of goes to the root and heart of the motivation behind absolutism. England is ripped apart by a civil war between Parliament and the king. Hobbes is witnessing this, and his country coming unhinged, falling apart, because the powers within the state, the Parliament and the king, can't agree with one another about the lines of authority in the kingdom. Who has the authority over things like taxation, over the religious institutions, and over the army? In this context, Hobbes, who is close to the monarchy in the 1640s, and in fact serves as a tutor for the young prince, he writes one of the clearest statements of absolutism in his book titled Leviathan. Hobbes's absolutism is different than John Bodin's, however. The essentials, in terms of what absolutism means, are the same, but Hobbes comes at absolutism from a different point of view from Bodin. Hobbes doesn't see absolutism as natural like Bodin does, nor does he think that any one person should be naturally in charge of other people. The monarchy for Hobbes is not the monarchy because God said so or because nature has made it that way. Hobbes believes all forms of government are essentially arbitrary. First and foremost, he believes that we are born into what he calls the state of nature. And this state of nature, we have absolute freedom to do whatever we want, However, Hobbes sees this state as one of inherent conflict, what he calls war with one another. And if that is true, what we need to do, Hobbes believes, is to establish some power, some authority over everyone to keep us from ripping each other to pieces. We need some authority in order to save us from the state of nature in Hobbes's mind. What we need to do is to agree to surrender our freedoms and rights that we have in the state of nature in order to buy stability, peace, and prosperity. For Hobbes, setting up an absolute sovereign really is the only reasonable answer in this exchange of rights and freedoms for stability, peace, and prosperity. Hobbes thinks that only an absolute sovereign can ensure that we will avoid things like war, rebellion, and dissension. Only when everybody agrees to surrender their freedoms to one authority can we be sure of the kind of stability that Hobbes desires. The quote that I have in the presentation kind of captures or summarizes fairly well Hobbes's thoughts in Leviathan. He writes, "It followeth that in such a condition every man has a right to everything." So this is in the state of nature, even to one another's body. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man. It's only when we move ourselves away from this state of nature, from this natural right, to a restricted form of human society, can we avoid this kind of violence. One of the reasons that absolutism is appealing to many during this period is the religious violence that follows the Reformation in many countries and kingdoms. As people begin to split away from the Catholic Church and their numbers grow and their influence grows, they begin to threaten certain areas of political authority. This religious violence could work both ways. On the one hand, an increasing number of people within a state can convert to Protestantism, putting pressure on the government to address so many of their people abandoning the Catholic Church. Or the king or prince could convert to Protestantism, putting pressure upon people who remain within the Catholic Church. In France, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics raged, in fact, over several decades between 1558 and 1598 in a series of wars. So it's not a continuous fighting, but several different smaller conflicts over an extended period of time. These wars of religion, as they come to be known, were fought between a group of French nobles who converted to Protestantism. And so the French nobles, the Protestant French nobles on one side, and the French monarchy remains Catholic on the other side. While the Protestant nobility are a minority, they are a powerful, well-funded minority who over the course of these 40 years are at war off and on with the monarchy, and they're supported to one degree or another by other Protestant states, and their ability to sustain this kind of conflict over a long period of time sort of demonstrates their influence and their threat to the Catholic French monarchy. The leader of the French Protestants is the man you see in the picture, Henry of Navarre, one of the more powerful nobles in France. And the end of the conflict comes when Henry is actually made king of France. So his relationship to the monarchy is that because the king doesn't have a son to succeed in the throne, Henry of Navarre is actually the closest living relative to the King of France on his death. So Henry of Navarre in 1598 becomes Henry IV, King of France. However, his title comes with a compromise. So after all of this violence, after sort of pulling France apart religiously and socially, Henry is going to heal or try to heal his kingdom by converting to Catholicism. As long as the Catholic nobles will recognize Henry as the right and lawful successor to the French throne, Henry himself will agree to become a Catholic. The Protestants, so his allies, his friends, the people he's been fighting alongside with for decades, are given a certain amount of religious liberty, the right to worship in France as they see fit. They won't be persecuted for that worship. Protestantism doesn't become an official religion in France, but it does under Henry become tolerated, at least tolerated to a certain degree, right up until the end of the 17th century. So for the next almost 100 years. All right, the second example, and we're not going to spend as much time on this one as we did the last one, simply because once you get into the 30 Years' War, it can be very difficult to get yourself out. Okay, but it is a good example of sort of how treaties very quickly